Report of the European Union Withdrawal Agreement Bill, Lord Callanan.
My Lords, I beg to move that this bill be now further considered on report.
The question is that this bill be now further considered on report. As many of that opinion will say content, the contrary not content, the contents have it. My Lords, we now return to the adjourned debate on Amendment 18.
My Lords, can I thank all noble lords who spoke before lunch. My Lords, the British public, as the noble Lord Dubbs said, and my noble friend Lord Taylor of Holbreach has said, is rightly supportive of our need to support vulnerable children most in need of our refuge and help. My Lords, Parliament and Government feel this too. There is no one group or party that has the monopoly on humanitarianism. My Lords, I think I must first correct some statements that noble lords made this morning. The first from the noble Lord Scriven, who said that if it wasn't for noble Lord Dubbs, the government wouldn't have done anything. My Lords, I will outline why this is not the case, without, of course, diminishing the noble Lord Dubbs' efforts over the years. My Lords, our record of the last 10 years, as my noble friend Lord Hamilton of Epsom pointed out this morning, clearly demonstrates that this government is committed to protecting vulnerable children. I reiterate our proud record, much of which goes back before the 2018 Act. Over 41,000 children have been granted protection in the UK since 2010, most of them under obligations through the Refugee Convention and wider commitment to resettlement rather than EU structures. Over 5,000 unaccompanied children are being cared for in England alone, a 146% increase since 2014, and we received over 3,000 asylum claims from unaccompanied children in 2018, the third highest intake of any EU member state, as my noble friend Lord Hamilton of Epsom pointed out, and 15% asylum claims from unaccompanied children across the EU. And of course, my Lords, our commitment to resettle 5,000 people in the next year alone from the wider region. My Lords, our refugee family reunion immigration rules provide an existing route for children to join refugee family members granted protection in the UK, with over 27,000 family reunion visas issued over the last 5 years, 3,000 issued to children, enabling them to reunite with family members under this route in the last year alone. The second point, my Lords, I feel I must correct is that of the noble Lord Kerr, that in the end we only agreed to let in 480 children rather than 3,500 as demanded under the noble Lord Dubbs' amendment. I think he might be confusing our obligations under Section 67 with the amendment which we have before us today, which only considers unaccompanied asylum-seeking children family reunion, and on which I hope I have demonstrated our commitment over the years. I reiterate that that policy in relation to UASC family reunion has not changed. This government was elected on a manifesto which includes a commitment to, and I quote, continue to grant asylum and support to refugees fleeing persecution. I do think the noble Lord Dubbs might be dancing on the head of a pin when saying that it excludes. Well, if the noble lords will hear me through, when they say it excludes children, I suggest that if that was challenged in court, the court might come to a different view. Furthermore, my Lords, the UK will continue to be bound by the Dublin regulation during the implementation period, which means that unaccompanied children in the EU and UK will continue to be able to reunite with family members during 2020. We will continue to process family reunion cases referred before the end of the implementation period. Our record reflects the unique importance of protecting unaccompanied children and preserving the principle of family reunion, and that policy has not changed. My noble and learned friend Lord Mackay provided some clarity on the effect of both Clause 37 and Section 17 of the European Union Withdrawal Act 2018. Section 17 does not grant family reunion rights to unaccompanied children. It only concerns negotiations on this matter, although I noted that the Noble Lord Kerr expressed disgust at the notion of negotiating. As per Lord Dubb's amendment, which became Section 17, the Government is, my Lords, and remains committed to seeking a reciprocal agreement for the family reunion of unaccompanied children seeking international protection in either the EU or the UK. That is to ensure that these vulnerable children can reunite with family members in the UK or the EU. Clause 37 only concerns the removal of the statutory duty to negotiate an agreement on family reunion for unaccompanied children who have applied for international protection in an EU member state and who have family in the UK, and vice versa. The debate is not, my Lords, on wider issues relating to refugees, asylum or family unity. Indeed, the Home Secretary has already written to the European Commission on the 22nd of October, which I outlined at committee stage, to commence negotiations on this issue, seeking to negotiate as Section 17 set out. I assure Noble Lords that this Government is intent on pursuing an agreement no less than that which we would have pursued under the original Section 17, as the Noble Lady Hannay posited earlier, although I can confirm I am unable to share the letter. However, a statutory negotiating objective in primary legislation is not necessary nor the constitutional norm. We are restoring the traditional division of competencies between Parliament and Government when it comes to negotiations, and similar changes when it comes to negotiations and similar changes have been made to negotiation obligations across the bill. Furthermore, my Lords, rather than removing Section 17, we have gone beyond Lord Dubbs's original amendment and provided that statutory guarantee that the Government will provide a statement of policy within 2 months of the Withdrawal Agreement Bill's passage into law. This demonstrates our commitment to report in a timely manner and guarantees Parliament the opportunity to provide scrutiny. And as I've said, we've already commenced negotiations. We will continue to deliver this negotiating commitment while removing an unnecessary statutory negotiating obligation, restoring those traditional divisions of competency and going above and beyond to providing Parliament with an additional opportunity to scrutinise Clause 37. My Lords, if I could just make one point, which is the question that Noble Lady Hannay raised about best interests. My Lords, in both, there is no intended nor actual legal difference between the phrasing about how and when the best interests of the child should be considered for child-family reunion transfers from the UK to the EU and vice versa. In both the original Section 17 and Section 17 as amended by Clause 37, it will be the case that there will be a consideration of whether it is in the best interests of the child to transfer from the EU to the UK in order to reunite with a family member and vice versa. Neither Section 17 nor Clause 37 ever intended to consider whether it was in the child's best interest to transfer to the UK or from the UK separately from the consideration of whether it is in their best interest to join their family member. And in addition to that, my Lords, our existing statutory obligation under Section 55...
The Noble Lady makes a characteristically careful and conscientious speech, and I learnt a lot from it. I'm very grateful. But could she just tell us why Clause 37 is in this bill?
Well, I think, as I explained at committee stage, Clause 37 is in this bill because the Government wished to reiterate its commitment, unlike it's similar in almost every way to Clause 17, except it doesn't instruct the Government to do something. It merely states the Government's intention to do something.
It waters down the commitment by making a completely different commitment to make a statement to the House rather than seek to negotiate a deal in Brussels.
That's correct. And if the Noble Lord is finished intervening, I would just finally ask noble lords to reconsider their intention to divide the House, because I hope I have provided the clarity necessary.
Well, my Lords, I'm grateful to the Minister for at least having again stated the government's position. But I'm bound to say I still don't understand it. Noble Lord Kerr explains why it was difficult to follow, and for all the time we've spent on it, it is not clear to me, and it's not clear to many noble lords in the House, including on the government benches, as to why the government is doing what it's doing. Part of the Minister's speech could have ended up with saying yes, and she supports the amendment. Part of the Minister's speech led to that conclusion, and then somehow she changed course and said no. And she talked about an unnecessary statutory obligation. I believe, I'm sure she means by that the 2018 Act, an obligation accepted by the government in the Commons after we passed it in this House. I don't know why it was okay then, but it's unnecessary today. That has not been explained. But above all, it seems to me, my Lords, there's a very clear proposition that family reunion, that unaccompanied child refugees should be able to join family members here. And all we're asking is that the government take that and negotiate on that basis with the EU. We cannot predict the outcome. It couldn't be more modest. It couldn't be more modest. All we're saying is, please do it. But the converse, by the government saying we're not going to do it, sends a very difficult signal. And some people have called the government mean and nasty. If the government wants to disprove the accusation that it is mean and nasty, then surely the thing to do is to accept the amendment. It's very simple. We do that, and then we're in line with what we decided in 2016. Yeah?
Record on admitting child refugees completely rule out any idea that it's been mean and nasty?
I don't think so. Partly because the majority of the 41,000 the Minister referred to actually came to this country by illegal means, because there were no legal means for them. We estimate that about 90% of those came on the back of lorries or in dinghies and so on. Surely that is the very thing we wish to discourage. So I'm frankly, my Lords, I'm not convinced by that. Of course, I welcome what the government has done for refugees, but we're talking about what we're going to do in the future. And I regret that the signal the government is sending by this is a very negative one. It is not a humanitarian signal, and there is no downside to the government if they accept the amendment. I don't understand what the problem is. Nobody has yet explained why the world will come to an end or something. It seems to me, my Lords, it's fairly straightforward. The House decided in 2018 a simple proposition, a humanitarian proposition. The government has tried to find a way of arguing against that. I'm sorry, my Lords, it has not persuaded me, and I hope it has not persuaded the House. I'd like to test the opinion of the House.
The question is that Amendment 18 be agreed to. As many of that opinion will say content. Content. The contrary not content. Not content. Clear the bar. There have voted content 300, not content 220. Sorry, I should have said the contents have it. Stupid.
You want to go now then?
Yeah, let's go. No, we're not doing any good here. Thanks.
Amendment 19, Baroness Hayter of Kentish Town.
My Lords, I rise to move Amendment 19 in the name of my noble friend, Lady Hayter of Kentish Town. One of the key issues in our debates has been the extent to which the United Kingdom would continue to safeguard protections of certain rights which derive from EU law. And the previous bill and assurances by the government did indicate that protections would remain. The government has repeatedly stated that whilst it doesn't intend to undercut EU regulations, it wants to retain the option of divergence and will therefore now refuse to sign up to level playing field provisions in a free trade agreement. But it's time to know, if we can, what that actually means and just what the government intends. Just last Friday, the Chancellor, Sajid Javid, told the Financial Times that Britain would never accept ongoing regulatory alignment with Brussels. Ministers are arguing that it's not necessary to sign up to minimum standards because in most cases the UK already exceeds what is required by EU directives or regulations. But we all know that is not true in all areas. The government is telling us to trust them, even though it's stripped out its previous commitments on workers' rights and on parliamentary oversight, and as we saw at committee stage, can't yet define the future relationship it wants with a range of the EU's executive agencies. We have, of course, been promised a groundbreaking new employment bill, but ministers will not tell us what its contents will be or set the timescales. We're not certain what engagement has taken place with trade unions, and whilst there's a need to regulate the gig economy, we need to be certain that this won't water down protections for other workers. Yesterday, the European Commission briefed EU27 diplomats on its preparations for the next round of Brexit negotiations. The presentation suggested that the EU will continue to advocate level playing field measures, with future cooperation to be underpinned by a single set of strong enforcement rules. And it's been suggested that if the UK breaches any of its commitments under the future trade agreements, it could be fined or lose its preferential access to certain sectors. Now, in response to the comments that Mr Javid made last week, one EU diplomat was quoted as saying, and I quote, "In the end, it's all rather simple. If Britain wants to diverge from EU rules, it will diverge. Such an approach would obviously lead to new trade hurdles between Britain and the EU, and in consequence, less trade, less investment, less jobs," unquote. Well, the government needs to be clear about its intentions. If it wants a Canada-style deal, it should be honest with the public about what the limitations of that approach. If it wants Canada plus or similar, and the economic and security benefits a closer relationship would bring, ministers need to be honest with the public that this will require a greater degree of alignment. Well, time, we know, is tight. The EU has been clear that it will not even adopt its negotiating mandate until the UK has departed at the end of this month, and there needs to be sufficient time left for ratification of any agreements, including by national and regional parliaments across the continent. My party has always been clear that we want a close economic relationship with the EU, and that regulatory alignment is not only a price worth paying, but would bring benefits to UK citizens. The government may disagree, and having won the election by promising to get Brexit done, it must, however, now get on with the job of telling people what post-Brexit Britain actually looks like. The purpose of this amendment is to set out the protections that we believe ought to be continued, and I look forward to hearing what the Minister has to say as to the extent to which assurance will be given as to those protections. For those reasons, I beg to move.
Amendment proposed. Insert the new clauses printed in the Marshall List.
My Lords, I rise to support this amendment and associate myself fully with the words of Lord Goldsmith, and as such I will be able to be brief. My Lords, up until the last weekend, the Government had resolutely maintained a twin-track narrative. Yes, they said, we will have an independent trading policy. Yes, they said, we will have frictionless trading within the European Union. My Lords, many of us during the committee stage tried to point out that these were in effect going to be mutually exclusive, and at the heart of this was regulatory standards. Many of us tried to explain that for frictionless trade, a level playing field for the EU27 means just that, a level playing field, no divergence. And the Minister, in his obdurate best, shrugged off those committee stage comments. Now, as Lord Goldsmith outlined at the weekend, in his interview with the Financial Times, the Chancellor Sajid Javid broke cover. He quashed any prospect of the Treasury lending its support to our country's leading manufacturing sectors. There will be no alignment, he said, very clear. And he urged companies to adjust to the new reality. A new reality for our automotive industry, for our aerospace industry, for pharmaceuticals, chemicals and food and drink industries, all of whom have been very clear of the vital need for alignment with EU regulations. And, Mr Javid added, we will need to do this by the end of the year. The end of the year, not long to wait. So, my Lords, at least one member of the government has told the truth. At least one member has told us where this government is headed. But it is simply amazing to me that any administration, never mind a Conservative one, should turn its backs on these important providers of jobs, these important providers of prosperity. This amendment would prevent ministers from using regulation-making powers under the bill to diminish standards or protections related to a series of protected matters. That sounds very dry and very cold. These protected matters affect everyone, and they're specified in the amendment. And they include environment, employment, social rights, animal welfare and public health. Really important aspects of our everyday lives and the everyday lives of people in this country. My Lords, this amendment, so ably proposed by Lord Goldsmith, in essence sets in writing the aspirations that the political agreement purported to set out. So, we now know that those aspirations come to naught. So, Minister, where is the government headed and what are going to happen to standards?
Lords, I would like to lend my support, and I have put my name to this amendment, and to add a couple of points which have not been previously made. We are, of course, going over ground which we pretty thoroughly discussed under Amendment 15 yesterday. But this is the ground is a bit different, but it's the same issue: level playing field, maintenance of EU standards, and so on. First point to make, and I hope the Noble Lord the Minister can reply to this, is that it's not a very onerous obligation, this, because I think he'll find, if he looks at the records, that we voted for every single one of these EU measures, which we are not going to regress from if this amendment were adopted. So if we voted for them, why do we now want to diverge from them? I wonder what the answer to that is. Now, another point which I think is important is that from everything that anyone who knows anything about Brussels knows, this is going to be an absolutely crucial factor in the political declaration implementation, the whole level playing field issue, and so on. I would honestly wager that if we accepted this amendment, we'd get a lot better deal than the one we'd get if we insist on diverging. And it is worth just remembering that the cost to this country in its trade of insisting on having the right to diverge will hit us long before we actually diverge, because it will affect the terms we get in the deal we do, and it will affect the way that inward investors and traders and so on assess the chances of trade between the UK and the 27 not becoming more friction-full. So there will be costs, and they'll be upfront. They won't be somewhere down the road, which can perhaps be avoided if we never do diverge. I must say I wouldn't be a bit surprised that, having beaten the tom-toms in this way in favour of divergence, the government actually found that diverging wasn't as brilliant as all that. And the third point I would make is as follows. Probably noble lords have not paid a huge amount of attention to what's going on in the internal deliberations in Brussels. But one of the Commission's main proposals, which I'm sure they're going to follow up, in the context of their Green Deal is to put tariffs on goods coming from countries who do not observe the same environmental conditions as those in the European Union, which could be us if we diverged, as the government, in the form of the Chancellor of the Exchequer, suggested we would do. Now, you may think or you may not think that the Commission proposal is a good idea. Personally, I don't think it's a very good idea on general world trade policy grounds. But the one thing you can't disagree with is that we are not going to influence very much what the EU27 decide to do. They'll do what they decide on their own inward dynamic, and there are strong forces pushing for this. So we may well find ourselves, in the not very distant future, confronted with a European Union which is putting tariffs on imports from countries that don't follow the same environmental rules as themselves. That will come on top of anything we negotiate this year, because you can bet your bottom dollar that any deal we negotiate will have an escape clause, a clause that enables the European Union to adjust its treatment of the trade of third countries, of which we will be one, on the basis of movement in their own policies. So I think there are some very serious issues at stake here. I think, in fact, if the government were to accept this amendment, it would cost nothing, and I hope that they will do so. But that is a hope which may take some time to blossom.
My Lords,
may I take this opportunity to support in principle, as I did on earlier occasions in the previous European Withdrawal Bill, the sentiments that lie behind this amendment. And may I take this opportunity to ask for clarification from my noble friend the Minister in summing up. In particular, as regards animal welfare, will my noble friend recall the time that we diverged from the rest of the European Union in, I think it was the early 1990s, by introducing a unilateral sow stall and tether ban, which we believed would pander to the animal welfare lobby and overnight ensure that the Conservatives appealed to a group with which were not familiar with the habit of voting Conservative. The outcome was not what we had hoped. The outcome was to push many of our pig producers out of business at that time and actually encourage more imports from countries such as Denmark and Poland, because the consumer who don't, in those circumstances, perhaps didn't buy their meat locally from butchers but went into the local supermarket and bought on price. So while I know that it may be appealing to introduce food into this country from other countries that don't meet our high standards, it is highly undesirable for a number of reasons. In this regard, would my noble friend take this opportunity to clarify the position of the government as regards to the introduction of a Standards Commission? Great progress was made in the last Parliament between the National Farmers Union and other farm organisations and the Department of Environment, Food and Rural Affairs, and it was generally understood that a Standards Commission would be introduced to ensure that our home-produced foods and farm products would not meet unfair competition. I know the general examples we use, we're all too familiar with hormone-produced beef and chlorinated chicken, but there's also poultry and other products from Brazil, Argentina and others. Will my noble friend take this opportunity to confirm that the government is indeed minded to introduce such a Standards Commission before the end of December this year? I would also ask, I don't see it on the list today, but I understand that there are potential problems looming on the Audiovisual Media Services Directive, with which I am not familiar, but having attended a conference this morning, I'm more familiar than I was yesterday. The Commission is due to introduce guidelines with which we will be obliged to follow, though they have not yet done so. We will not have a regulator in place immediately, though I understand the Government is going to announce an interim regulator imminently. But will the Minister confirm, please, what the status of this directive will be as part of retained UK law, as it has already been adopted but not yet implemented? I think it would be very helpful if the Minister could outline to the House today what that will be. And noble Lords, Lord Goldsmith, who so eloquently introduced this bill, did refer to, amongst others, chemical safety, in addition to biodiversity, the environment, animal welfare, food safety and others. And I'd just like to end on a question to my noble friend. What is the situation as regards new chemicals which will be introduced in this country that we would hope to export to the European market in the run-up to December this year, when we will only have an OEP, an Office for Environmental Protection, fully in place by the 1st of January 2021?
I'm no thespian, and my abilities as a scriptwriter are minimal. However, I've prepared a 60-second play to entertain your lordships this afternoon. Imagine the scene, a chance encounter between the Prime Minister and one of those voters from the Red Wall constituencies who lent his or her vote to the Conservatives on the basis that they would get Brexit done. I thought we might stage this in the National Railway Museum in York. However, I have to tell you this play is not a comedy. I'm going to call my protagonist Billy for the sake of argument. Billy, the withdrawal bill before the election had protections for my EU workers' rights, but these protections have been removed from the current withdrawal bill. Why? Prime Minister. No problem. The protections will be in an employment bill later this year. Billy. Ah, yes. I saw you stated in the Queen's speech briefing that the employment bill would, quote, protect and enhance workers' rights as the UK leaves the EU, making Britain the best place in the world to work. And I noted your manifesto said you will, quote, raise standards in areas like workers' rights. Prime Minister, well, there you are then. Billy, but ministers have said that there'll be no dynamic alignment, and yesterday the Chancellor of the Exchequer said no regulatory alignment either. Yep. Prime Minister, correct. Billy, but that means you could cut my rights, you could reduce my EU right to paid holiday from 4 weeks to 2. Prime Minister, that's not our intention, but you must understand that we can't have our hands tied in negotiations with the EU. Billy, now I understand. The EU might want to cut the rights of British workers, and you want the freedom to defend them. Prime Minister, not quite. The EU will be seeking to defend your rights. It's the British government which might need to threaten to reduce them. Billy, but I thought when I voted to take back control, the British government would stand up for British workers' rights. Prime Minister, not quite. Dramatic pause. Billy, I've been conned. You've done me up like a, expletive deleted, kepper. The end. Lords, I ask the Minister whether the government will give the assurance that they will not permit workers in the United Kingdom to have less rights now or in the future than those of their counterparts in the EU, or the US, or any other country with whom a free trade agreement is sought. If that assurance is given, this amendment will be unnecessary. If that assurance is not given, then the noble Minister should not mince words and should state clearly that in these negotiations the British government will not defend the rights of British workers.
My Lords, after that rather enjoyable contribution, and despite the very distinguished movers of this motion, I do find the whole thing a little bit puzzling. First of all, surely it is obvious that we are a responsible
trading nations, seeking the highest gold standards of regulation and standards and welfare, and that if we want to be in business of trade and expand our trade in the great markets of Asia, Africa, America, as well as our neighbours in Europe, we have got to observe rigorously the best international standards. That is a must. Even if we had a choice in this matter, which we don't, we would have to pursue that course. Secondly, is it not obvious that in exporting, as we must, not only to the great European market, but to the Americas, to Asia, where, in fact, all the major growth in consumer markets is going to be over the next 10 years, and into Africa as well, and Latin America, into all these countries, we will have to conform very strictly to their standards as customers. If we're measuring the design and thickness of windscreens in motor cars, the windscreen provisions laid down within the European common market will have to be observed, as we won't sell cars into the European Union. The same for America, quite different standards. The same for India, quite different standards. The same for China, quite different standards. Again, we are going to have to be very flexible in all our patterns of standards and regulations governing the health and safety and conditions and durability and all the other conformities required in these new markets. That is going to happen anyway. And thirdly, the EU standards in some areas are excellent, and no doubt we will parallel and continue with them as we have before, but some of them are a little out of date. We're now moving into a world where the predominant pattern of our European economies is services. We're a service economy. Frankly, job security is not what it was for anybody, so that we need to redesign rights and benefits and support for millions of workers in a world where the old guarantees of a job for life and so on and security, which the great trade unions battled for in the past, are no longer going to be there. A new pattern of work has emerged, totally new pattern, in which business is going to be operated in completely different ways. This requires a completely fresh approach to the pattern of benefits and security and protection and support, which we must pioneer in this country. Now, why we should want, with all the variety of the markets, all the variety of standards we've got to meet, all the variety of regulations to be a successful exporter into China and so on, why we should want to be tied solely to and aligned solely with the pattern of our neighbours in the remains of the European Union is to me, frankly, a puzzle. I see the motive behind it, I see the concern, I see the worry that there may be a sliding away of standards, but the reality is that we have no choice but to maintain very high standards indeed, varied export market demand standards of a whole variety and different kind, and there is no choice in this matter at all. So a great deal of this level playing field stuff, I don't think, is driven by those concerns, as it should be, the concerns of protecting workers in the new environment and new working conditions of the digital age. I think it's driven by something else, and that I would say to the very noble and distinguished movers of this motion is something worth considering before they press it, because I don't think it fits into the modern world in which we are moving.
The importance of this amendment cannot be overstated. At a time when the government likes to tell us repeatedly how well they are doing on employment in this country, this always overlooks the growing anxiety in the country about the conditions in which many of those people working are working, and the exploitation, sometimes quite ruthless, that is going on. There is a real anticipated anxiety that a driving force, wherever it's coming from, within number 10 or wherever, that the real objective of so much of this legislation is about reaching a situation in which we can have a deregulated society and a free-for-all. That is the belief, that is the conviction, which many people believe is behind it all. That is why what is said about employment and social rights is so important in this protection list. If I were to pick one other, but I care about the whole protection list, but if I were to pick one other, my Lords, we are living in an acute and immediate crisis with the environment and biodiversity. Unless we take this seriously, the kind of problems that will overtake our society in the future could dwarf any of the preoccupations which take up so much of our time in Parliament at the moment. It is imperative to ensure that we don't just have good intentions, great aspirations, but that we actually have the means to deliver what we are aspiring to in this context. We must, therefore, insist upon the standards which have so far been achieved, not as an end in themselves, but as a platform from which we can move forward to still stronger, more imaginative action. My Lords, I cannot say how much I welcome this amendment.
My Lords, I rise to offer the Green Group's support for this amendment. Your Lordship's House will have noticed that we're not quite as crowded as we were when we were debating Lord Dubb's amendment. But I'd invite your Lordships to consider all the people who aren't here, the people who are now out in our supermarkets, in our streets, in our workplaces, in our wilderness areas. We've been talking about these as the EU standards, but I would call these the people's standards, because these are standards that were won by campaigns, by struggles, by people in the UK and across the EU who stood up against the lobbyists, stood up against the corporate interests, stood up against those who have so much power in deciding the kind of standards in places like the United States of America, stood up for something better. Now, the government keeps saying that it wants to have higher standards than these people's standards that we've had to fight so hard to get. Well, I entirely accept the need for those much higher standards. In this hugely nature-depleted country, where we are collectively consuming the resources of 3 planets, our share of 3 planets every year, although we only have one, where we have pumping out so much greenhouse gases, where, as the noble Lord Hendy so eloquently outlined, we have people in really desperate workplace situations. We do need better standards, but these people's standards are a foundation. Now, I'm sure we're going to hear from the benches opposite very often and crucially about the UK's crucial place in the UN climate talks, COP26, this year. Well, I would ask your Lordship's House to consider what kind of message this amendment, if the government does not incorporate it into the Withdrawal Agreement Bill, what kind of message that is sending about us as the chair of COP26.
My Lords, this amendment proposes that we should not regress from existing EU-derived rights and practices in relation to the protected matters that are specified in the amendment. And I see no difficulty in principle about that. I think there may be much merit in terms of continuity of public policy and in terms of reassuring the public that we will maintain the standards that have so far been established by the EU and continue to conform with those. But it is essential, surely, my Lords, that we do retain the right to diverge. Reasons that the noble Lord Howell gave are very important indeed. The world is changing, and our country and our economy needs to be alert to all the changes that are going to provide opportunity for us in the future as we seek our fortune in a wider world. The Eurozone economy is a relatively inert and sluggish region of the global economy, and while much has been achieved, very important protections have been established for workers' rights and environmental issues, as the noble lady just mentioned, and we do not want to lose that acquis, those achievements, those benefits. We've got to be flexible, we've got to be able to be innovative. My Lords, the essential principle of Brexit is that we take back control of our laws. It's an entirely reasonable proposition that this Parliament should legislate to perpetuate our conformance with certain particular laws that have already been enacted. It's a very different proposition. And this is not what is envisaged in the amendment, but it did seem to be something contemplated by a number of noble lords in their speeches. It's a very different proposition that we should commit ourselves to the proverbial level playing field, to the principle of non-divergence for the future following the end of the implementation period. If taking back control of our laws means anything, it means that we must reserve the right to diverge in the future, and indeed we will need to have the right to diverge even from what has already been established and achieved, as it proves, in some sense, obsolescent, as new reasons, new horizons emerge for the kind of changes and developments that we would seek to achieve in our economy.
Thank you to all noble lords who have taken part in this debate. Thank you to Lord Goldsmith for so eloquently introducing the subject. My lords, this amendment is very much like the new Clause 31 tabled by Baroness Jones of Whitchurch during the committee stage of this bill. And I'm grateful to the noble lady and other noble lords who took part in the debate on that amendment as well. And noble lords will be completely unsurprised to discover that the government's position on this matter remains unchanged. The amendment, I think, fundamentally mistakes the nature of the bill before us. This amendment is about our domestic policy post-exit in a number of extremely important areas. But, my lords, by contrast, this bill is about implementing the withdrawal agreement into domestic law. It is not about our post-exit domestic policy, important though that is. Therefore, we do believe that this amendment is wholly inappropriate for this bill. But, however, since the amendment has drawn us into a debate which, even though it's beyond the scope and purpose of this bill, it may be useful for noble lords for me to reiterate how we will take decisions about issues such as environmental standards and other matters once we have left the EU. Now, as I set out during the committee stage, these matters were debated extensively during the passage of the 2018 EU Withdrawal Act. I remember replying to the debate then. I think many of the same noble lords who contributed today took part in that debate then as well. Back then, though, noble lords will remember that the concern that was raised was that the Section 8 power in that Act would be used to regress from EU standards. Let me reiterate once again that the Section 8 power can only be used for the purposes of correcting deficiencies that arise as a consequence of the UK's withdrawal. That's what we've said then, and I think our record has proven that to be the case. The 2018 Act does not provide a power to change laws simply because the government did not like them before exit, and the government cannot use the powers for the purposes of simply rolling back standards and protections merely because we wish to do so. Instead, where we seek to depart substantively from retained EU law, separate legislation will be brought forward, as indeed it already is in certain areas. At that point, Parliament will, as normal, have its opportunity to scrutinise the government's actions. This will allow for tailored and intense scrutiny, and I have no doubt whatsoever that this House and the other place will fulfil their duties in this regard with great vigour. Once again, I should reiterate, our view is that these are debates for that future legislation. In any case, I can reassure noble lords that this government has no plans to introduce legislation that would have a regressive effect. We will not weaken protections in these areas when we leave the European Union, but rather we will maintain and enhance our already high standards. Now, we spoke at length during committee stage about the government's record on the environment, on chemicals, on food standards, animal welfare, And let me, again, for the sake of clarity, set out some of our commitments. Firstly, with regard to the environment, the UK has a long and proud history in these areas, and it is of the utmost importance that this is maintained when we leave the EU. And there are areas that we are already planning to go further than EU legislation permits, for instance, single-use plastics. The Government will shortly be introducing the Environment Bill, which we promised during the 2018 debates, which will strengthen environmental protections and will enshrine environmental principles in law. And let me take this opportunity to reply to the point made by my noble friend Baroness McIntosh on the subject of sow stalls, a debate that I remember well from my time in the European Parliament. But of course, that is an example of the UK going beyond EU rules in the full knowledge of what was likely to happen as a consequence. We chose to go further. We may decide, I'm not committing us, but we may decide to go further on live animal exports, areas that we want to go further, enhance what protections are currently provided under EU law, and if we do so, we should consider the consequences of that. But as Lord Howarth, I think, correctly pointed out, the whole point, my view, of Brexit, this is about taking back control. These are decisions that we can make for ourselves in this Parliament in future. We don't have to have an external power dictating to us what we do in these regards. On the subject of employment rights, let me reassure Lord Goldsmith that we are committed to ensuring that workers' rights are protected as the UK leaves the EU. We are legislating in areas where the EU is only just starting to catch up. It is the UK that has been shaping the agenda on tackling abuses on the gig economy, and I thought that was a point well made by my noble friend Lord Howell of Guildford. And as we announced in the Queen's speech, we will be bringing forward legislation to continue to deliver and to build on the Good Work Plan. This will give workers in the UK the protections that they need in a changing world of work. And much as I greatly enjoyed the entertaining vignette from Lord Hendy, let me remind him that on a number of these areas, on holiday pay and on maternity pay, the UK already goes much further than EU minimum standards permit. This is something that we should be proud of and something that we are going to build on. So I've set out my view, the government's view, that this amendment is not appropriate for this particular bill. I have also, I hope, provided some reassurance about the government's intentions regarding some of the issues raised by the amendment. I will close by noting that the actual effect of the amendment itself is entirely unclear. My Lords, the clause before us makes government actions with a, quote, regressive effect unlawful, but it leaves many of the key terms unworkably vague. And I have to say, I thought it was somewhat surprising that the noble and learned Lord Goldsmith does not seem to appreciate this fact of the poor wording of the amendment. Firstly, the lack of definitions of the, quote, protected matters make the scope of the amendment unclear. Second, the uncertainties in the definition of a regressive effect would create a great deal of legal uncertainty. Perhaps he's hoping for some legal uncertainty as more work for lawyers. Regressive, that was a joke, by the way, it was not a serious comment. Regressive effect is defined as an effect that, quote, reduces a minimal technical standard or weakens governance processes associated with that standard or protection. The meaning of a reduction or a weakening in this context is not at all straightforward. My Lords, making this regressive effect unlawful without a clear definition carries significant legal risks. In fact, it may actually restrict policy with a progressive design, as government may avoid making policy changes for fear of acting unlawfully. This could impede delivery of post-Brexit government policy, which is actually intended to deliver improvements in these areas. So let me give noble Lords an example. The Waste Framework Directive sets targets for preparing for reuse and recycling of waste to achieve the EU's ambition to move to a circular economy. I think we would all support that. The targets are set on weight. So the directive obliges Member States to ensure that a minimum of 55% by weight of municipal waste is reused and recycled by 2025, 60% by 2020, 65% by 2035. However, weight-based targets may not lead to the optimal environmental outcome. Under this amendment, if the UK, for example, were to remove this target and replace it with a target set on a different metric, for example, on carbon, whilst the UK could actually, in that case, have improved standards, we could still be held to have regressed on environmental protections were this amendment to end up as law. My Lords, this kind of legal uncertainty has been decried in other debates. This bill is the vehicle to implement the withdrawal agreement in domestic law. It is not to legislate for our post-exit domestic policy in these areas. These are for separate debates in separate forum, and we will no doubt have them with great vigour, as we do in all of these policy areas. This amendment is neither necessary nor appropriate for this bill. The bill will ensure that we can move forward and focus on our domestic priorities. Noble Lords already have the ability to scrutinise any changes which regulations might make to retained EU law under the Section 8 power, as I said earlier, and I can say again, for the benefit of clarity, that the Government is absolutely committed to maintaining and enhancing our already high standards, including through legislation, where appropriate. I hope, given the reassurances that I've been able to provide, that the Noble Lord will feel able to withdraw their amendments. I will take an intervention.
I'm most grateful. I followed my noble friend's arguments very, very closely, and I did understand him to say that Section 8 can only be used to correct deficiencies following from the EU withdrawal bill. It was very comprehensive, his summing up, but he didn't respond to the potential obvious deficiencies in this audiovisual media services directive. It may be that this is not the only directive that falls into this category, but it's a category that I banged on about ad nauseum in the first EU withdrawal bill, and this is still not being resolved. So will my noble friend, if he's not able to answer today, could he come back and perhaps write to me and tell me, and anybody else who's spoken in this debate, what the legal position is if the Commission has... It's one of those categories where we've not implemented the directive, but we are now leaving the European Union, and it does become part of retained law, I would argue, in a very deficient way.
Well, of course, if it becomes part of retained EU law before the end of the implementation period, then it would be transferred into British law by the snapshotting of the procedure. But I don't know the particular details of that directive, so I will certainly undertake to write to the noble lady about it.
Well, I thank the Minister for his reply. I certainly thank all noble lords who've taken part in this debate, particularly those, and it's the majority, who've supported this amendment. Let me just clear one or two matters out of the way from what the noble Lord the Minister said. First of all, as to the scope of the bill, well, there wasn't a problem in including certain protections of this sort in the bill before the election. It's revised now, so I didn't really follow that point. Secondly, he sees imperfections in the bill. Well, I've been in government too, and we always had the ability to improve when amendments are put forward, the substance of which we agree with, to put forward something which will cure that problem. That's not the reason that the government is resisting this amendment. We all know that. The government are not resisting this amendment because they don't want to be committed, despite what has been said before, to non-regression. I make the point, it's non-regression. The clue is in the title that we've got here. And it's about the standards being lowered. Of course they can be improved. Of course they can be changed, so long as, under this amendment, they are not reduced. And that is the concern, that for some reason it appears to be ideological purity, the government are not prepared to give that guarantee. I was very taken by the vignette, by the play of the noble lord, my noble friend, Lord Hendy. I've heard him in court before. It's the first time I've heard him in Parliament. As persuasive there as he is in court. But ideological purity risks damaging this country and the people in it. And the point that was made by the noble Lord Hannay, that actually the very fact that we are insisting, the government is insisting on this divergence, will itself cause damage already. Well, we've given the government the opportunity of giving assurances about this. Everyone will very closely read in Hansard what the noble Lord has said. We've given them the opportunity to give stronger assurances to the outside world and to the people within it, to the workers in it, and the invitation is not accepted. If the if, as many think, the result will be damage to the country and to people within it, to the rights which people believe we're going to have protected, then we know at whose door the fault will lie. My Lords, I'm not going to press the amendment because there's no point with the government in the position it is in the other place. It's clear that they will not accept this or anything like it, but we will continue to hold the government to the warm words and carefully define and interpret what they are to see how far they go. My Lords, I beg leave to withdraw the amendment.
Is it your Lordship's pleasure that this amendment be withdrawn? Amendment is by leave withdrawn in clause 38, Amendment 20, Baroness Hayter of Kentish Town.
I rise to move this one, which is a key reassurance to both Scotland and to Wales. As we know, clause 38 as it stands is pretty meaningless. It was, as we said at committee, basically added as a sop to the European Reform Group. But as the explanatory memo makes clear, the clause makes no material difference to the scope of Parliament's powers. So the problem with it is more for what it doesn't say. By failing to refer to the Sewell Convention, that the UK Parliament will not normally use its powers to legislate and devolve matters without the agreement of the National Assembly and indeed the Scottish Parliament. So this standalone restatement of what I would call the bleeding obvious in regards to Parliament, without even a nod to the conventions, does appear to backtrack on the devolution settlements. The Welsh Government would therefore wish the Sewell Convention to be restated. The Noble and Learned Lord, the Minister, said last week it wasn't necessary because these settlements are already written into law. Well, perhaps they are, but it's also no need, for the same reason, to restate parliamentary sovereignty. The problem is to do one without the other gives the impression that the convention is being downplayed. That is not helpful. I think I'm right in saying that the Welsh Assembly, even at this moment, is debating the issue of legislative consent, and the rejection of this amendment will not be taken well by that gathering. For all sorts of reasons, it would indeed be a poor precedent for this bill, the first to be passed without legislative consent from the Welsh Assembly. Now, the government could decide to remove what the Noble Lord Newby urged them at committee and to take out clause 38 altogether, which certainly would not detract from the bill. So they could still do that, or they could accept this amendment. Either move would offer comfort to each of the devolved authorities that our departure from the EU is not being used to take back any powers or activities from their purview. And such reassurance, I know, would be welcome. The clock in Wales is ticking. I do hope the Noble Lord the Minister could accept this amendment. I beg to move.
Amendment proposed at page 37, line 27, after the words Kingdom, insert the words published on the Marshall list.
This amendment and just rise briefly to explain why. I think Baroness Hayter has made clear that, in a sense, this clause is superfluous, but in a way it's superfluous in a slightly sinister way, because it's asserting the sovereignty of Parliament and effectively saying, therefore, this Parliament can always overrule the devolved legislatures on any circumstances. We know that to be sovereign law, but to put it in a bill is really to rub salt into slightly open wounds, actually. We have a situation where Scotland and Northern Ireland have already refused consent, and it's expected that Wales could vote today to do the same. We have, over the last 20 years, developed what is described as a quasi-federal constitution, but it isn't federal. It is unitary, and Parliament in Westminster is sovereign. That is a fact. But the whole point about the Sewell Convention was to try and give comfort and reassurance to the devolved legislatures that they had a standing and a status that Westminster would take into account and would acknowledge and, in all circumstances, do their best to accommodate. It is a convention, it's not a law. That is obviously the argument as to why maybe we should move towards a federal constitution which would effectively convert those conventions into law. And can I say that I welcome the fact that the Labour Party is now engaged in serious consideration of federalism, which has been a long-standing policy aspiration of the Liberal Democrats, and quite genuinely we should work together and across party to try and develop the thinking behind this. But I think the point that is, I think, actually the Minister's words may matter, not just the terms of the legislation, which is a sense of concern that as powers come back from Brussels to the UK, those that are not clearly going back directly to the devolved legislatures and administrations come to the UK central government and actually effectually weaken the existing devolution settlement, unless there is a genuine spirit of cooperation where the devolved administration's views are properly weighed and taken into account. And for the government simply to say, we brought back control to a sovereign parliament, whether you like it or not, this parliament can do what it likes and we intend to do so, is not a really good way to take the UK forward. I do not subscribe to the view necessarily that Brexit makes the breakup of the United Kingdom more or less likely. I think the pain and disruption of Brexit might well discourage people in Scotland and Ireland to want to add other disruptions to it, and I don't think it is clear as simple as that. But what I would say, it behoves the government to show an absolutely genuine engagement with the devolved administrations to ensure that they are not just using sweet words, but they are practically looking for solutions that will ensure the devolved administrations are taken into account. For the government simply to turn around and say, we hear how you voted, but we're carrying on regardless, is not going to provide comfort and confidence that devolution is here for real and is here to develop. It really does require the government to show a lot more accommodation. And I agree with the Baroness Hayter, there's two ways to resolve this. The government could simply repeal the clause and just leave the bill vacant on this, or it could accept the amendment. But to do neither of those things, I think, would leave people in all the devolved areas very suspicious of the government's intentions.
I think it's fair to say that if we hadn't been in the EU when devolution occurred, we would most certainly have moved towards a more federal arrangement in this country. The fact that our regulations were shared across the UK, even in devolved areas, really covered the need for a federal arrangement where the different assemblies and parliaments can come together. Now that we are going to be out of the EU, there is a fair degree of urgency that we address this, how we're going to devise regulations in the future. But if we start that process by not including the Sewell Convention at this point, I think we're going to start from a point where we are at such levels of disagreement that it will be hard to have that debate in a calm, careful way. So I think if we could accept this amendment at this time, but also go on to explore the ways we will work together in the future across territorial areas where devolved matters intersect. So I hope you can move to accept this amendment.
Well done. I rise very briefly in support of this amendment to which I've added my name. I have explained earlier in the day and yesterday the importance of this government recognising as we go forward the importance of devolution. This is a purely symbolic clause. It doesn't make any difference. It could be left out. But if it is to go in, can it please acknowledge that we live in a United Kingdom that has changed, and in a United Kingdom where we must recognise the devolved legislatures. Conventions are, in this respect, of the utmost importance and should be recognised on the face of the bill.
Well, I try to follow all these arguments that are put forward about devolution and where it all stands, and the puzzle to me is the logic of the people moving this amendment, to me, is that the Parliament here in Westminster is not entirely sovereign, and that may be an issue that we wish to take up at some point in the future, but I would have thought it's not something that we should be dealing with in the withdrawal bill. It would seem to me the way the amendment is phrased would make it, not being a lawyer, but it would seem to me to make it justiciable, any things that come up between the devolved administrations and Westminster. And really, at this point, I think I would oppose the amendment on the point of view that it will detract from sovereignty of Westminster without actually having thought through all the implications.
I can't really think that that is how things play out. Yesterday, I heard that an agreement had been made that would mean a vote last evening would not be put. On the strength of that, I arranged with my wife at last to take her out for dinner. And then everything changed, and there was to be a vote, and indeed there were 2 votes. I slipped out before any of that happened to phone my wife to say, dinner's off. I simply make the plea that we distinguish between what's in the marriage contract and the conventions that we create for ourselves that help marriages and relationships to flourish. This is a convention. It's not a law, but in granting this convention, in incorporating it on the face of the bill, we will improve the relationship between us and the people in the devolved administrations. It's so simple. You mustn't... I mean, we've heard arguments earlier about things being set in stone. I've heard about the thin end of the wedge. Who remembers reading F.N. Cornford's Microcosmographica Academica? There's one or two. These are the educated people. But it was an argument about what happens in academic circles, where there's always a body of people who are resistant to change. And they're resistant to change on the grounds that it might be the thin end of the wedge, that it might set things in concrete, and all the things I've been hearing in these wretched debates. Please, my lords, let us acknowledge that the softer acknowledgements of relationship, as well as the hard ones, help the debate and the relationships forward.
I had not intended to speak, but I've listened over the last week to the various representatives of the devolved administrations in this union of ours. And speaking as a totally English person, without any relationships in any of the 3 devolved areas other than to be married to an Ulsterman, I think we English ought to be very careful, and we ought to be listening to what the devolved areas are saying to us. And it was said earlier that it may be that this government doesn't really appreciate, and perhaps many English people don't really appreciate, what devolution has meant. And perhaps it's time we did.
My Lords, I rise briefly to support this amendment for the putting in statutory form what has grown to be a convention, an important convention. I would like clarification of what I failed to get in yesterday's debate regarding the width and the breadth of the convention, because I did ask a specific question: would the Minister clarify and emphasise the legislative consent would normally be required for any regulation that would be brought under this Act, in particular Clause 21. Since I did not get satisfaction from the Minister's reply, I repeated the matter afterwards. I said I might be a slow learner, but following the point made by the noble and learned Lord Thomas, I would like to know which specific points cannot be dealt with by a Section 109 order. That Section 109 order would be a consensual matter as opposed to an imposed one from Westminster. The Minister in reply said, "I cannot give the noble and learned Lord the answer to that question, but I can give him the assurance from speaking to my legal advisers that in the negotiations that will unfold, there will be areas that we think will be under discussion that might stand outside those areas I've touched regarding Section 109 and the ability to direct Welsh ministers." Perhaps now, after some more thought, the front bench can give the clarification which I required as regards how the Convention would be implemented from the viewpoint of Her Majesty's Government.
My Lords, like others who've spoken about devolution, I've made many points and I won't repeat them. But I do think it's important that the Government doesn't misinterpret the vote to leave the EU on the back of the slogan of taking back control as a vote for yet more concentration of power in the hands of people who work within a mile or so of this building. People actually do want to have a sense of direct influence over their own lives and things that really matter to them. This amendment simply supports the status quo of the Sewell Convention. It respects the relationship between Westminster, Scottish Parliament and the Senate. And I would urge the Government to recognise it does nothing at all to constrain their agility in negotiating and their ability to negotiate. But if the culture change that earlier on today the noble Lord Howarth spoke about so eloquently is to happen, then surely we must recognise that there is a government other than the one that's in this chamber and at the other end of this building.
I'd like to reply to the point made by the noble Lord the Duke of Montrose when he was suggesting, I think, that the inclusion of this amendment in the bill would render the Convention justiciable. There was something about it that would attract the attention of the judiciary. But Lords, I've lived with the Sewell Convention for a very long time, and in particular with the amendment to the Scotland Act, which is now enshrined in Section 28(8). One of the points that was made by the Smith Commission was that they wanted the Sewell Convention to be given statutory effect. That battle was lost, I'm afraid, and because, as Section 28(8) of the Scotland Act puts it, it remains a convention, and it's made perfectly clear, indeed, by the Supreme Court when he considered the matter that it is not justiciable, it's simply a convention. My Lords, for my part, having, as I say, lived with the convention right through the 1918 Act repeatedly, I relied on assurances by ministers that they would respect the convention. It was not actually written in to the Act, as I recorded. So for my part, I shall listen very carefully to what the noble Lord the Minister has to say, because the way this has been handled in the past has been by assurances given by ministers which the House has respected. I'm not certain that it's necessary to write it in this way, but if I don't get that kind of assurance, then I might go with this amendment. But the words that the Minister used will be extremely important to me in deciding what to do.
Been admirably made by many other distinguished speakers. I'll just make one point, and that is that I think this whole issue shows the frailty, unfortunately, of devolution as a basis for keeping our partnership of nations together. Devolution had weaknesses built into, admirable change though it was. As many of us said before, the regulatory relationships between the nations were left extremely, if you like, unregulated and in a very imperfect condition, depending, as Lord Thomas has, my colleague Lord Thomas has said, depending on the power of the word convention, which hovers over the English Constitution in a very dangerous way. The other thing to be said about devolution as a frail basis for a settlement is that it is deliberately asymmetrical. And an asymmetrical devolution means an unequal distribution. Wales has always been treated as a poorer relation in this partnership, and when there are possibilities of strain, as we see in the case of this Act, then the thing is liable to crumble. So this whole basic weakness of the settlement is likely, alas, to continue and to weaken the United Kingdom. It is appropriate, perhaps, that these aspects are implications of the work of King Henry VIII. It was King Henry VIII who was the master voice, despite his background of English nationalism. He adopted a colonial attitude to Wales, and that is reflected in the current difficulties that we have.
My Lords, I haven't added my name to this amendment, but I'd like to register my support for it. 12 months ago, actually to this week, Vaughan Gething, the Welsh Cabinet Secretary for Health and Social Services, was asked whether, if the Senedd refused to grant consent to an Act of Parliament, could the Senedd be overruled by Westminster? His reply was, I thought, interesting. He said, the ability of the UK Parliament to override a measure made in any part of the UK is one of the mischiefs in the UK's constitution that needs fixing. I don't for a moment suggest that we begin the fixing process today, but I merely quote his words as a fairly accurate summing up of the situation in which we find ourselves today. The exclusion of a reference to the status of the devolved administrations in Clause 38 appears to be deliberate. It seems to be designed to ensure that the devolved administrations have no role to play in the UK's withdrawal from the EU, and it enshrines by this omission the inequality of the power between the nations of the UK. The inclusion of Amendment 20 into Clause 38 would go some way to redress the balance and ensure that the devolved administrations could represent the views of their respective nations in this massively important process. I'm a passionate advocate for the Senedd. I believe strongly in the principles of devolution, as do my colleagues on these benches. The Senedd has given Wales a voice and a feeling of nationhood. The exclusion of this amendment could lead to the perception of both being taken away. My Lords, accepting or passing this amendment would go some way in preventing those losses.
Not normal for me to speak at this moment. I thought the noble Lord the Minister would want to reflect that, having heard this debate and they've been following it, the Welsh Parliament has just voted not to give consent to the bill.
Well, can I thank all noble lords who have contributed to this debate, and it's obvious that I have now spent so long debating across this chamber with Baroness Hayter that she has now been able to predict my replies to these questions. And because the government does feel that this amendment is an unnecessary restatement of the Sewell principles, which are already enshrined in statute. However, I accept that the points made both by the noble lady and the noble Lord Murphy in the committee stage debate last week, that it is not the justiciability of the Sewell Convention that matters most in these cases. What matters is that the government continues to uphold the Sewell Convention and make sure that the interests of the devolved administrations and the people in Scotland, in Wales and in Northern Ireland are fully taken account of as we leave the European Union. And I am happy to make that commitment and demonstrate that we have done so in the passage of this bill as well. And I can reassure the noble Lord, Lord Bruce, and indeed Baroness Bryan, that the Government has engaged constructively with the devolved administrations and with the Northern Ireland Civil Service when there was no executive throughout the development of this Withdrawal Agreement Bill. And I'm sure noble Lords will join me in welcoming the restoration of the institutions in Northern Ireland. We will now have an assembly to engage with as well. But we have been discussing this bill with the Scottish and Welsh governments, as well as the Northern Ireland Civil Service, since July 2018. And we have incorporated suggestions from those administrations into the White Paper, and we discussed its contents with them in the following months. And following those discussions, the UK Government made significant changes to the bill, including ensuring that devolved ministers will have a clear role in the functioning of the Independent Monitoring Authority that will monitor the citizens' rights provisions in the bill, restricting the powers in clauses 18 and 19 from amending the devolution statutes, and strictly limiting the number of provisions protected from modification by the devolved institutions to those of a constitutional nature. My Lords, we strongly believe that the changes we have made and the process that we have followed have respected the devolution settlement, in line with the Sewell Convention and the usual practices and procedures. We did seek consent, and I can reassure Lord Griffiths that we have worked extensively with the devolved administrations to reach agreement in the hope that we would be able to achieve consent for this bill. It is worth noting that the Scottish Government has publicly stated that it would refuse consent for any EU exit bill. We took all reasonable steps to secure consent while respecting the constitutional fabric of the United Kingdom. And this is not affecting our work with the devolved administrations on other EU exit-related legislation. Earlier this month, the UK Government introduced the Direct Payments to Farmers Legislative Continuity Bill into Parliament. The Government sought consent for the relevant parts of that bill, and the Scottish Parliament voted to provide that consent earlier this month. This will ensure that the UK Government and devolved administrations have the necessary powers to provide the direct payments to farmers after we leave the EU on January 31st. As Baroness Hayter informed us, we just discovered that the National Assembly of Wales has voted not to consent to those parts of the bill for which we sought that consent. And we are, of course, disappointed that the devolved legislatures have withheld consent, and we recognise the significance of proceeding without that consent. However, these are nevertheless exceptional circumstances. The bill must proceed so we can deliver on the referendum result and leave the EU by the end of this month. We will...
My Lord, this clause which we are debating as unamended restates the principle of parliamentary sovereignty. Many of us considered that the devolution settlement had modified the Victorian concept of unitary sovereignty. Lord Keane at the committee stage went out of the way to reassert that A.V. Dicey's views on parliamentary sovereignty, that the Imperial Parliament is supreme and cannot share legislative power with other assemblies below, is what this clause means. Does he not therefore recognise that the inclusion of this clause as it stands undermines the conventions established by the devolution settlement?
I'm not sure I want to get into an arcane legal debate with himself, Lord Keane and others, but no, I don't accept what the noble Lord is saying. I don't think it does undermine the settlement. We will, of course, continue to seek legislative consent. We will continue to take on board views, and we will continue to work with the devolved administrations on future legislation, whether related to EU exit or otherwise, just as we always have.
Grateful to the noble Lord. There was much wisdom from Lord Griffiths of Bury Point. It would help the atmospherics a very great deal if the Minister could reassure the Scots and the Welsh, I think the Northern Irish are reassured already, that they will be included in the United Kingdom team negotiating in the joint committee. I say that because I think it's right to try to improve the atmosphere, and I think that after all these years, the Lady Griffith is entitled to a dinner out.
She is indeed. I hope the noble lord will want to repeat last night's failed endeavour at some stage in the future. I think the noble lord makes a good point, and we have already started discussions with Scottish and Welsh ministers, and hopefully to come with Northern Ireland ministers. I've been present in some of those discussions that we had in London a couple of weeks ago. We have a ministerial framework that's put in place, the joint ministerial committees, a number of them, first of all, on EU negotiations, one on ongoing EU business, which I chair. And we will want to develop those consultations as we go into the next phase. And we are working on proposals to do that, to involve them in future negotiations. So, of course, we want to take that point on board. We understand the importance of preserving both the spirit and the letter of the devolution settlements and the principles of the Sewell Convention as the UK exits the EU. And let me reply directly to the question from Lord Morris that international relations are indeed a reserved matter. However, the devolved administrations do have an important role in implementing these agreements. Any devolved provisions made under the Act will normally only be made with the agreement of the devolved administrations, and we will engage with them on this as we always have done in the past. So the Government is committed to uphold these principles, but this is not changed by restating them in this bill. And therefore, given what I've said and the reassurances that I've been able to make, I hope the noble lady will feel able to withdraw her amendment.
Well, I think noble Minister for that, though obviously saddened by the response that we've had, because clearly my noble friend Lord Griffiths does abide by the conventions laid down by Lady Griffiths. And we would have done well, I think, to listen to the noble and learned Lady Butler-Sloss, that really we need to listen to the devolved areas and what they're saying. We feel that the government is not doing this, that it is, after all, the devolved regions that have come to us and said we are not getting enough of a hearing. I won't repeat what everyone said, but the comments are general. We need to give respect. We need to respect the convention. It offers, as Lord Bruce, comfort and reassurance. In the words of my noble friend Lady Brian, confidence. This is all about recognising the convention as part and parcel of our whole parliamentary system. It is a convention. It doesn't override parliamentary sovereignty. It is a part of the way we are. I think it is a terrible shame that the government cannot see that this detracts nothing from the bill, but I seek to add it to the bill. I therefore beg leave to test the opinion of the House.
Yeah. I'm sorry, I missed that. Test the opinion of the House, did you say? Yes. The question is that this amendment be agreed to. All those that are of that opinion will say content. Yes. Contrary, not content. Not content. Clear the bar. There have voted content 239, not content 235, so the contents have it. In Clause 41, Amendment 21, Baroness Jolly.
But I will be brief. Clause 41 is a clause which allows ministers to make regulations
that could alter any primary legislation that has been passed prior to this bill. Such regulations will be made by the negative procedure, effectively giving ministers carte blanche to do what they will to legislation that is already in statute. The Act that many of us in the health community in your Lordship's House were recently involved with was the Healthcare (open brackets) European Economic Area and Switzerland Arrangements (close brackets) Act 2019. Noble Lords will remember that it started life as the Healthcare (open brackets) International Arrangements (close brackets) Bill. A significant number of changes were made to that bill by this House and then approved by the Commons. But this clause could allow ministers to revert the bill to the original, so thwarting the will of Parliament. Or they could at any time change any component of it or any other bill with the minimum amount of scrutiny. And when you come to think of it, my lords, its scope is really quite breathtaking. At committee, my noble friend, Baroness Brinton, asked the Minister about a letter that she, Baroness Brinton, had left with the government's whip's office, which the Minister had not seen and was unable to answer in as much detail as she would normally. Since then, the Minister has sent noble lords a letter outlining the situation, for which we were all very grateful. So, as well as responding to the amendment, I'm sure other noble lords will want to press the Minister on the detail of the letter so we can have the government's intentions on the record about any proposed changes to legislation relating to healthcare and the EU. My lords, it's not my intention to press this amendment.
Amendment proposed, page 40, line 3. Insert the words printed in the Marshall list.
My Lords, the European Union Committee report on BrExit, the revised Withdrawal Agreement and Political Agreement, notes the lack of any mention of reciprocal health arrangements and says in the section on mobility on pages 56 and 57, clauses 252 to 57, that clarity is needed on how this would work, which is one of the reasons that I asked the Minister questions at the committee stage. And I'm sorry for both our parts that the message with that question didn't get through. And I too thank her for the letter that she sent over the weekend. The reason that this is important is that the EU committee says there is no reference in this section of the Declaration to Reciprocal Healthcare, including the European Health Insurance Card, as a means for facilitating mobility. And it was that means of facilitating mobility that was absolutely critical for the Healthcare European Economic Area and Switzerland Arrangements Act 2019, and with your Lordship's permission I will shorten that to Healthcare Arrangements Act rather than repeat it every time. And so I asked the Minister to explain why there was no mention of this reciprocal healthcare, and if she could confirm explicitly to the House that these arrangements will stand. Parts of her letter were very helpful on specific points relating to those EU citizens living and working in the UK at the moment and UK citizens living and working in the EU. But that is not as broad as the provisions of the Healthcare Arrangements Act. That's why the committee raised its concerns, specifically using the phrase as a means for facilitating mobility. Now, the Minister's letter made rather an odd assertion that healthcare arrangements are protected by Clause 13 of the EU Withdrawal Agreement Bill, which covers social security systems. Now, nowhere in Clause 13 is there any reference to healthcare, nor is there any such reference in the Healthcare Arrangements Act either. But more worryingly, if she is right and I am wrong, the decision to change arrangements under Clause 13 are at complete odds with the decision arrangements made in the Healthcare Arrangements Act. Clause 13 reinserts the Henry VIII powers that were the original Health Arrangements Bill when published, and both your Lordship's House and then the Government decided that this was inappropriate, and that's why that bill was changed and became an act in April. Now, clauses 6 and 7 in the Healthcare Arrangements Act set out clear routes for changes via statutory instruments and reports to Parliament. It is transparent and accountable, unlike Clause 13, where responsibility for such decisions are given to the Minister of the Crown and or a devolved authority. So I wonder, can the Minister confirm that any arrangements relating to healthcare arrangements would fall under the Healthcare Arrangements Act, Clauses 6 and 7, given that they do not relate to social security? This amendment tries to make sure that we have that protection for reciprocal healthcare.
My Lords, I hadn't expected to speak to this amendment, and I will be exceedingly brief, and I don't want to take away the attention from the healthcare issues that have been raised by my two colleagues. But we all know in this House that when legislation is passed, it is later used as precedent. And we have here a clause that effectively permits the government, by negative statutory instrument, to change a huge raft of primary legislation passed by this Parliament through both houses. If I had described that to a neutral person without mentioning that it was a move by the UK government, I think they would have assumed that this was being moved by Putin or by Erdogan or by someone else who sees a democratic structure as a mechanism that they can reshape to assert government control over the general democratic process. I'm extremely concerned by this precedent, its extraordinary scope, and it fits in with a pattern, if I may say, of a government approach to this Parliament that it seems to me is diminishing the other House even more than this House. I think we can see in this and in the attitude towards negotiations, the government's position we just heard on devolved assemblies, we can see it in its attitude towards future trade negotiations, where it in a sense is patterning itself after local government, where an executive cabinet can make all the rules, the Assembly can scrutinise, that's its role, scrutiny only, and I refer to the other House as well, can scrutinise. It can raise issues, but the executive can simply ignore it. And I think this is a road that is exceedingly dangerous. This piece of legislation and this cause advances that process. And I do think that everyone in this House, regardless of the party to which they are affiliated and which they support, need to take on board that pattern that is being developed and which this clause, Clause 41, underpins. And it requires, I think, a very serious rethink before we lose what we have had, and it's too late just to regret it.
My Lords, I've added my name to this amendment, and I think I've added it to this amendment for a reason which keeps coming up in our debates, which are all about trust, and whether you can actually trust the government to behave in a reasonable way. And I think a lot of the amendments that have gone down have been about trying to ensure that, if I may put it as crudely as this, the government behaves well in carrying out these negotiations. And we saw a lot of it, a kind of emotional blindness, if I may put it that way, in the discussions we've had on immigration systems and physical documents that people who had a right to live here could use. This seems to me another piece of work in which we have to put down something, we have to put an amendment down to try to ensure that the government behaves properly and well in these negotiations. And I think it is quite extraordinary that, having agreed these reciprocal healthcare arrangements with the EU countries and Switzerland so recently, I can't understand why we shouldn't just be able to use this amendment to ensure that there are no rapid changes. It almost seems to forget the huge number of people who in their daily living move between, for holidays, the other 27 EU countries and Switzerland, as though this doesn't matter. This is an important part of people's lives. They book their holidays. They assume that the system is going to change. No, that is not going to change. No one has told them, particularly after this recent piece of legislation, no one has told them that there's a risk that something may change. The government is actually bringing on itself a mood in which people will be suspicious of what they're up to, and you raise a lot of anxieties totally unnecessarily. Rumours spread around quite quickly. My experience of government, if you let rumours foster, they actually move around quite quickly. And I think what we're trying to do here is remove the temptation with this amendment, and I think the government will be wise to listen, unless the Minister can give a level of assurance that will actually remove any doubt that somehow, because of the way they behave, the government's up to something.
I'd like to thank Baroness Jolly and Baroness Brinton for introducing this. It's basically, we are, as Noble Lady Baroness Jolly and Brinton said, picking up where we left off in committee, where I have to say to the Noble Lady, the Minister, that I was not satisfied with the answer that the Noble Lady gave about reciprocal health care. And as the Noble Lords have now said, is nobody really understands why, when we already have legislation that we considered and passed last March, why that it doesn't form part of the negotiation which is going to take place. I read the letter that the Noble Lady and the Minister sent to the Noble Lady Baroness Brinton, and it is very confusing. I'm going to take a more cynical view of this, because when we had in front of us a year ago the International Healthcare Arrangements Bill, it had in it 5 or 6 Henry VIII powers. It gave the Secretary of State the power to make a deal about healthcare with anybody in the world that they might choose to do so without any recourse to this Parliament or any accountability. This House very wisely changed that into the bill that we passed and which is now the Act, and which actually does what the government had said they would do. They said they would not add to the policy arrangements in any area. They would take up the European Union policy and translate it into a way that worked post-Brexit. And that bill that we had before us a year ago didn't do that. It extended incredibly the powers. And what I fear here is that we can see a repeat of what the government tried to do a year ago. So I really need to know from the Noble Lady, the Minister, what powers the government may take in this arrangement, and not what is going to happen between now and December, but what is going to happen in a year's time. What will it look like? Will there be any reciprocal healthcare arrangements? Will there be 27 agreements, which is what the Minister was talking to us about actually a year ago when we were discussing the international healthcare and we were looking at crashing out of the European Union? 27 agreements. What's happened to them? Where have they gone? It's not only a matter of time, as my noble friend, previous noble friend, still noble friend, said, people will become very anxious about this because not only are people working all the way across Europe, but they also are going on holiday all the way across Europe. And at the moment, the Department of Health and Social Care's website is really opaque. It doesn't give us any clarity at all about what might happen.
Well, my Lords, it is always a pleasure to rise to speak to what is a really important issue of reciprocal healthcare, which does touch on a lot of UK and EU citizens' lives. And rightly, I think this House has tested this issue robustly. And it is right, I think, that we consider this today. So the Withdrawal Agreement Bill guarantees that reciprocal healthcare arrangements, including for pensioners, workers, students, tourists and other temporary EEA or Swiss visitors will not be affected during the implementation period. That means that during this time there will be no changes to reciprocal healthcare schemes such as the S1 and EHIC schemes and the S2 route, which enables planned treatment. Importantly, I would like to provide assurance that the Withdrawal Agreement Bill also guarantees lifelong reciprocal healthcare entitlements for people who are within the scope of the citizens' rights agreements, so long as they remain within that scope. That includes UK nationals who have moved to the EU before the 31st of December 2020, as well as EU citizens who became residents in the UK before that time. And I hope that is clearer perhaps than my letter. My Lords, last year this House, as has been mentioned, spent a considerable amount of time holding very informed and important debates on scrutinising the provisions of the Healthcare EEA and Switzerland Arrangements Bill. I think I'm going to call it HESA, with the permission of Noble Baroness Brinton. I believe we all agreed that this is a key piece of legislation which provides the UK with options to implement any future reciprocal healthcare arrangements subject to negotiations with the EEA states or Switzerland after the UK leaves the EU. And I understand the desire to know what the outcomes of those negotiations are, but obviously as they are in the future, I'm not able to give the exact detail of where they are, other than the fact that we do want to make sure that we have the best outcomes possible. Following that scrutiny and the assent of Parliament, Sorry.
I thank my noble friend for giving way. I'd just like to mention at this juncture that a number of us on these benches have been, as she well knows, deeply, deeply uncomfortable with what we are being told. But we are willing to give the government the benefit of the doubt. And we hope that the trust that we show is going to be repaid. But I would be really grateful, as we're talking about people's health and lives, and there's really nothing much more important than people's health, whether my noble friend could take back to the department or assure us that there will be full information available and provided to all citizens so that they know that there is this risk at the end of 2020 and can make decisions with full information, because obviously none of us know what will happen after the end of this year.
My noble friend Baroness Altman makes a very important point, and we have tried to ensure that the communication and the information is available. I'm very happy to review the clarity of that information and make sure that we do everything that we can to improve it, because she is absolutely right that we need to make sure that not only do we keep the level of anxiety to the lowest level, but we need to make sure that people are as prepared as possible. But I can absolutely assure the House that we are doing everything that we can to work in the best interests of UK citizens, and we do understand that there will be many in European countries as well as in the UK who will be looking at this issue with great concern. Now, I would just like to get back to the process of the scrutiny of HESA, because that did establish a legal basis, as the Noble Baroness Brinton has said, for the Secretary of State for Social Care to fund, to give effect to future reciprocal healthcare schemes through its provisions for data sharing and making regulations. And it's important for us to take our minds back to that debate. That is an implementation bill. It is not the status of the arrangements. And the government is committed, in addition to that, to the effective implementation of the Citizens' Rights Agreement and the healthcare protections that it provides to people. But in answer to some of the questions which have been raised around the letter which I sent and some of the questions which Noble Baroness Brinton raised last week, I have been asked why there is no mention in this case of reciprocal healthcare in the bill. This is because individuals in scope of the Withdrawal Agreement are entitled to reciprocal healthcare cover from their competent country for as long as they remain in scope of the agreement, as I have said. And the rights of EU citizens, EEA, EFTA and Swiss nationals and their family members who reside in the UK before the implementation period are brought into UK law through Clause 5 and Clause 6 of the bill. In addition to this, I was asked about Clause 13, and this is limited to implementing parts of the agreement on social security coordination and including reciprocal healthcare and EHIC. So it cannot operate in the way which the noble Baroness was concerned that it might. And finally, I was asked whether the consequential powers could be used to revert HESA to its original form, which it came to this House in, with global scope, and it cannot. The consequential power does not allow for substantive changes to legislation. It would enable the government to only allow them to make smaller technical amendments for good housekeeping to ensure that legislation is consistent and functions well. So it could not be used in the underhand manner, which I think the noble Baroness Thornton, thinks that we intend it to do. This would be much too substantial a use of the power. It would not be considered an appropriate use of it. I would like to assure the House the Government has carefully considered the legislation that has been put before this House. We've taken all possible steps to make sure that we have the necessary powers for reciprocal healthcare, but also that it links in with the Withdrawal Agreement and the Withdrawal Agreement Bill to make sure that we have the robust protections it provides for the rights of UK nationals and EU citizens living in the EU and the UK respectively. We have no intention of repealing HESA in the consequence of the Withdrawal Agreement Bill. And critically, this Act allows the UK to implement the agreements, responding to a range of outcomes in the negotiations with the EU on any future reciprocal healthcare agreements which we know are likely to come forward. The amendment, I know, was tabled by the noble Baroness with some of these concerns. I hope that I have answered the questions which have come forward today, but this is a routine power to make regulations which are appropriate in consequence of this bill. So I hope that, turning to the amendment, I have answered the way in which the consequential amendment would be used to respond to the complexity of provisions and the legislative landscape which we would need to respond to. And on that basis, I hope that the noble Baroness feels sufficiently assured to withdraw her amendment.
My Lords, I think we've had an interesting debate which has not, for the most part, been about the legislation itself or the Clause 41, but about health, and I guess that was always the way it was going to happen. I'm quite happy to withdraw the amendment.
Is it your Lordship's pleasure that this amendment be withdrawn? Amendment by leave withdrawn. Schedule 2, Amendment 22, Lord Hutton of Furness, not moved. 23, 24, not moved. 25, 26, 27, 28, not moved. Amendment 29, Schedule 4, Lord Howarth of Newport.
My Lords, this is the grand finale of our report stage, and if the chamber isn't packed, then I'm not personally dismayed, because we prefer quality to quantity in our debates, don't we? My Lords, Clause 41, Sections 1 and 2, as the noble Baroness Jolly explained just now in the preceding debate, contains breathtaking powers, to use her word. I quote from the very valuable report of the Delegated Powers and Regulatory Reform Committee. Clause 41 contains a Henry VIII power for a Minister of the Crown by regulations to repeal or amend any Act of Parliament passed from time immemorial until the end of the transitional period, the end of 2020, as part of such provision as the Minister considers appropriate in consequence of the Act. Such regulations are made pursuant to the negative procedure. And that provision for the negative procedure is set out in Schedule 4 on page 68, line 9, and it is that point of the bill that I seek to amend. Clause 41 and Schedule 4 provide a sort of portmanteau Henry VIII's power. It is the ultimate set of Henry VIII's powers. You can go no further in terms of Henry VIII's powers than the government seeks to go in these provisions. The government may seek to defend itself on the basis that these powers are provided in the context of consequential and transitional provision.
But if the Minister seeks, in the pursuit of the policy that is set out in the bill as a whole, to amend primary legislation, there is nothing at all in the legislation to inhibit him in any way from doing so. The government might also seek to defend itself on the basis that the courts in practice would construe pretty strictly what powers the government sought to exercise under these provisions. But, my lords, we don't want these matters going to the courts. And if they do go to the courts, it takes the judges into political terrain that it's much better that they keep out of. The government takes powers in Clause 41 to amend or indeed repeal any previous enactment up until the end of this year. Now, the noble and learned Lord Judge pointed out to us yesterday that a certain provision of Magna Carta was vulnerable under the policy adumbrated in the bill. Well, I'm sure that the Minister, when he comes to respond, will explain that he has no intention of repealing Magna Carta. And indeed, we've already been reassured in previous debates that the government doesn't intend to use the Henry VIII powers with which it has peppered this bill to undo the devolution settlements or to pursue other draconian purposes. But, my lords, it is really a constitutional monstrosity that the government has written into this bill at this point in the bill. And as the Baroness Kramer said to us just now, this is a bad precedent. It's an improper precedent. Unless the government can produce a justification, which I find unimaginable, for the taking of these extravagant powers, then they shouldn't write them into the bill at all. And in an age of populism, as she suggested, it is particularly undesirable that extreme powers are taken casually, and it's important that I think it's a proper responsibility of your Lordship's House to keep an eye on what's going on, and where legislative practice becomes unacceptable, to point that out to the other place. My lords, the other place, if members of Parliament in the other place peruse the bill and inform themselves in close detail about it, I think they may consider that they've been rather insulted. And I think we should certainly give them the opportunity to consider that possibility. And members of Parliament on the Conservative side of the House of Commons might be uneasy about what appears to be in conflict with the Conservative Party manifesto. I've taken the precaution of looking at the Conservative Party manifesto, and in the section entitled Protect Our Democracy, it is asserted, as Conservatives, we stand for democracy and the rule of law. And it goes on to say that once we get BrExit done, Britain will take back control of its laws. But, my lords, I don't think that when voters studied the Conservative Party manifesto and when Conservative parliamentary candidates took it as their oath of prospective office, they actually thought that taking back control of our laws following BrExit would mean a power grab on the part of the executive, which potentially is happening. Our ministers have sought already to reassure us in the debates we held on Clause 21 and on Clause 26. It was insisted that there were no such malign intentions as the legislation would make possible. And they wanted to reassure us by pointing out that the regulation-making powers so extensively set out in relation to Clause 21 and Clause 26 could only be exercised under the affirmative resolution procedure. Well, that is a mitigating circumstance, but it by no means undoes the mischief of taking the Henry VIII powers in the first place. And the noble Lord Duncan of Springbank, in the letter that he wrote to us, acknowledged, however, that the powers that it's proposed that the government should have under Clause 41, the regulation-making powers, would be exercisable under the negative resolution procedure. And he gave no explanation or justification for that, Now, I don't know whether this was a drafting error, that this inconsistency in approach, this resort to very extensive regulation-making powers under the negative procedure at Clause 41 was a mistake. But if it was, then there's going to be an opportunity for the government to amend it. The bill, following upon the amendments that your Lordship's House has made, is going to go back to the House of Commons. It would be quite easy for the government to amend the bill in this regard, and it could do so with no loss of face, with no loss of dignity. When governments are flush with electoral success, they do have a tendency to swagger. And I would suggest that the bigger the majority, the higher the euphoria of electoral success that the government feels, the greater the importance that the government acts soberly when it comes to legislating and proceeds in its dealings with Parliament with humility and magnanimity. Magnanimity is a Latinate word which I hope will appeal to the Prime Minister. But if humility and magnanimity are too difficult, at least they should conduct themselves in relation to Parliament with respect and courtesy. Macho attitudes to legislation make for bad law. Now, the manifesto goes on to say we need to look at broader aspects of our constitution, the relation between the government, Parliament and the courts. Well, indeed, my lords, our scrutiny of the bill thus far has indicated that there is a very great deal for the government to think about as it considers, and as the commission it proposes to set up, considers the relationship between the government, Parliament and the court. The manifesto then goes on to say that in particular the new government and its commission will want to look at the role of the House of Lords. Well, I do hope that ministers and members of Parliament in the other place will understand that the traditional constitutional role of your Lordship's House is to act as an advisory chamber, to act as a revising chamber, and that the principal way in which the House of Lords offers its advice and proffers its revisions is by way of amendments to legislation. And in doing so, your Lordship's House poses no threat to the government. There is no lèse-majesté. And in all the debates that we've had on this bill, it's very clear that this House accepts that the government has a mandate for Brexit, and there is no attempt on the part of your Lordships to subvert Brexit and to thwart the government in its purpose of enacting this withdrawal legislation. Our purpose, I give way to the noble Lord.
It will be true that since the election and the outstanding victory of the Prime Minister, that this House does finally accept that there is a government in power that wants to deliver Brexit. But that certainly wasn't true before the election, and a very large number of amendments were passed by your Lordships, which were passed precisely to actually stop us leaving the EU, and were actually wrecking amendments and went completely in the face of the decision that had been taken by the people in the referendum.
I share, as he well knows, some of the frustrations of the noble Lord in the last Parliament. But I would point out that what this House did in the last Parliament was not to subvert the authority of the elected House. It actually sought to be in consonance with the wishes of the elected House. So I don't think that members of Parliament need be concerned. They need not have been concerned in the last Parliament that the House of Lords was in some sense a threat to the House of Commons, and that plainly is not the case in this Parliament. My Lords, this amendment, number 29, is a moderate amendment. There are two issues in question. One is the issue of Henry VIII's powers and the government's propensity to take excessive Henry VIII's powers. The other is the issue of procedure, the manner in which Parliament should approve the regulation-making powers that would be brought forward under this legislation. Now, my amendment does not seek to remove the Henry VIII's powers. It does not say that this Clause 41 should not stand part. I don't know what the consequences would be for the proper functioning of the legislation if I had sought to do that. So what I have sought to do is to amend that aspect of the bill which deals with the procedure for adopting regulation-making powers. And I hope the government will accept that it would be appropriate to substitute for the negative resolution procedure the affirmative resolution procedure. Even then, the amendment would not be ideal, because if your Lordship's House, as my noble friend Lady Hayter has observed earlier in our debates, if your Lordship's House were to reject an affirmative regulation-making powers under the affirmative procedure, there would be howls of protest. It would be regarded as a constitutional outrage on the part of your Lordship's House. But at any rate, if the government is willing to accept this amendment, it will enable Parliament as a whole, both Houses of Parliament, to express their view on the legislation, and indeed, if necessary, for either House to reject any attempt that the government might make by way of regulations to alter the principles of law or to rewrite primary legislation. My Lords, I beg to move.
Amendment proposed, page 68, line 9, leave out from 41, bracket 1, bracket, to end of line 10, and insert words printed in the Marshall list.
I do offer my apologies to the Deputy Speaker. I put my name to this amendment. We discussed a few days ago both clauses 21 and 26, as the noble Lord Howarth has referred, and people called it a constitutional outrage. This is far, far worse. As a constitutional issue, Clause 41, sub-clause 1, takes the government into realms which I, in the years I've been in this House, have never actually seen before. The noble lady, Lady Kramer, has already set out most of what I wanted to say and put it rather better than I would put it. So there isn't a great deal to say, except that basically, if the government is going to say, as I am sure it will, that it's not proposing to use these powers other than to a very limited extent, the short answer to that, speaking as a lawyer, is why have them here? Why put something so unbelievably wide into the withdrawal bill if it's not intended to use it? To have anything that could go from Magna Carta, not actually Magna Carta, but from any law enacted in the past until, in fact, the end of this year. But as the noble Lord Howarth has already said, it is not his or my intention to get rid of this objectionable clause, but purely and simply to alleviate it, so that if, in fact, the government does require to make such provision in consequence of this Act, at least we can have a look at it. And at least the Commons, if they get over their 80 majority and look more critically at the legislation to see if it is really what is wanted, they can at least look on affirmative resolution at what is being offered by the government. So I support it. I do believe that it needs to be brought forward both to this House and to the other place, because as clauses go, this really goes beyond belief.
My Lords, we have reached the final amendment. I thank both Lord Howarth and Baroness Butler-Schloss for their comments and for setting out their positions on this. And I do understand that noble lords are concerned about the parliamentary procedure attached to the consequential power at Clause 41 of this bill. Indeed, we have already noted these concerns, and a number of noble lords in other debates have raised them. And of course, we all read closely the report of the Delegated Powers and Regulatory Reform Committee and the Constitution Committee. And, my Lords, I did address many of these points last week when I spoke to the amendment tabled in the name of the noble Lord, Lord Tope. And I hope today to provide similar reassurances to the noble Lord, Lord Howarth, on which, of course, I agree with so many of the points that he makes on EU withdrawal, although perhaps not this one. As noble lords are aware, consequential powers are standard provisions in legislation, even legislation of great constitutional significance, such as the Scotland Act. And if noble lords will look at Schedule 5 of this bill, they will see that we have already included many of the consequential amendments that are required as a result of this Act. But we also believe that we need to take a power to make further consequential provisions to the statute book. Now, I'm aware that the noble Lord, Lord Howell, yesterday asked for assurance as to why the consequential power at Clause 41 is subject to the negative procedures. And, my lords, I understand the noble lord's concern, but let me reiterate that the power is limited to making amendments that are consequential to the context of the Act itself. Its scope is very different to the powers discussed over the last 10 days by my noble friend Baroness Williams and Lord Duncan, which will be used to implement the actual withdrawal agreement. And we do believe that it's in everyone's interest that the statute book functions effectively. Moving the consequential provision to the affirmative procedure would frustrate the ability of departments to make those necessary consequential changes before exit day, and could indeed lead to legal uncertainty. And I hope that noble lords will agree with me that this is not the appropriate course of action. This procedure is limited to giving ministers the power to make regulations that are in consequence of the Act. Like consequential powers in many other pieces of primary legislation, this power will be construed strictly by the courts. It can only be used to make amendments that are appropriate to legislation in consequence of something that this Act does. As I'm sure noble lords will agree, the use of the negative procedure does not prevent parliamentary scrutiny from taking place. Members of this House will still have the opportunity to pray against regulations should they consider them inappropriate, as is usual for regulations of this kind. Now, I hope I've been able to provide the necessary reassurances to the noble lord, and as a consequence of what I've said, I hope that he will be able to withdraw his amendment.
The noble lord, Lord Callanan, has not provided me with the reassurance that I seek, and in some of my earlier remarks, I think I anticipated the arguments that he would offer us as to why we can be relaxed about these powers being taken, and believe him when he says that the scope would be really minimal. It's not the case. I'm extremely grateful to the noble Baroness Butler-Sloss, speaking as a most distinguished lawyer. She encourages me in my legal amateurism to believe that I'm on the right track. I think I am. I hope that even overnight the noble Lord the Minister may be willing to reflect further on this, and as I say, that the government will accept the amendment, because I think it would be an earnest of the magnanimity on the part of the government that I ventured to hope it might manifest.
On the noble lord briefly, just for the avoidance of any doubt that this will not be a matter that we would be reflecting further upon. So, therefore, if he wishes to pursue his amendment, then he really needs to test the opinion of the House now.
So I hope that the government might want to demonstrate its good intentions in terms of its future constitutional behaviour. But there it is. My lords, we can't win every battle, but maybe in the watches of the night, he will repent and reconsider. And on that basis, I seek leave to withdraw the amendment.
Your Lordship's pleasure that this amendment be withdrawn. Amendment by leave withdrawn.
My Lord, I beg to move that the House do now adjourn during pleasure.
The question is that the House do now adjourn during pleasure. As many as are of that opinion will say content. Contrary, not content. The contents have it.
Third reading of the European Union Withdrawal Agreement Bill, Lord Callanan.
My Lords. My Lords, I have it in command from Her Majesty the Queen to acquaint the House that Her Majesty, having been informed of the purport of the European Union Withdrawal Agreement Bill, has consented to place her prerogative and interests, so far as they are affected by the bill, at the disposal of Parliament for the purposes of the bill.
My Lords, I beg to move that the bill be now read a third time.
The question is that this bill be now read a third time. As many as are of that opinion will say content. Content. The contrary not content. The contents have it.
My Lords, I beg to move that this bill do now pass, and in moving this motion, I hope the House will forgive me if I say a few words. We are, I am delighted to say, now in the final stretch of our withdrawal from the European Union. Over the past days and weeks, your Lordships have debated the merits of this bill, and I would like to thank the vast majority of noble Lords who have engaged so constructively in this process. I think it is a testament to the importance of what we are doing and the experience and expertise that noble Lords have to offer. I would particularly like to thank my colleagues on the front bench, particularly the Leader, the Chief Whip, for their unstinting support, generally, and I would like to... And if I could also thank all of my ministerial colleagues, and if I could be impolite and single out two in particular who I think have done a sterling job in Lord Keane and Baroness Williams, whose support, guidance and their efforts in this House have been unstinting, but many other colleagues have helped as well. I would also like to pay tribute to my opposition counterparts, to the two formidable Baronesses, Ludford and Hayter, who have worked so hard and kept us on our toes throughout the bill's progress. I'd also like to note in particular the valuable work of the select committees of this House, so ably chaired by the noble Lords Lord Bencathra, Earl Kenoull and Baroness Taylor. As I noted during my second reading speech, their scrutiny and insight is most valuable, and their ability to report on the bill so quickly in order to aid the debate is, I think, to be commended. Finally, I would like to pay tribute to my private office, to Bianca Russo and Joe Moore, who have generally exceeded all their hours, even in excess of what the Working Time Directive would proceed them to do, and officials across government who have worked tirelessly on this bill for many months and indeed years, particularly the bill managers, Ollie Eilert and Hugo Gillibrand. Personally, I would particularly like to thank those government lawyers who have patiently briefed me on everything from glossing, which apparently has nothing to do with paint, to consequential amendments and all of the legal technicalities in between. My Lords, I would like to take a moment to note that we are disappointed that the devolved legislatures have not consented to those parts of the bill for which we sought their consent. I want to be clear that the government does recognise the significance of proceeding with this bill without the consent of those legislatures. Nevertheless, these are exceptional circumstances that we find ourselves in. The bill must proceed so that we can deliver on the referendum result and leave the EU at the end of the month with a deal in place. However, I want to make it clear that we will continue to uphold and abide by the spirit of the Sewell Convention, and as I made clear earlier today, and I look forward to continuing to work with the devolved administrations and the legislatures on future legislation. Now, the other place will consider amendments which have been made in our House tomorrow. Of course, it is your Lordship's right and duty to rigorously scrutinise legislation and to hold the government to account, and, if necessary, to ask the other place to think again when you think that is appropriate. But I would like to take this opportunity to remind noble Lords that we received a clear message from the elected House on the 9th of January. We have had important debates. Noble Lords have made their views known, and we must now see what the elected House thinks of those amendments tomorrow. All noble lords must bear in mind that as we prepare to leave the EU on the 31st of January and deliver the Brexit that the people voted for. My lords, I beg to move.
Yeah. The question is that this bill do now pass.
My lords, this is a time, I think, both for thanks and also regrets, and both are heartfelt and serious. We have a lot to thank the ministers, all 5 of them, I think, as well as their whips, for they have kept to their script, they've given us no surprises, they've worked with courtesy and information to enable the process to proceed smoothly. The Bill team has performed above and beyond normal expectations. Second reading and 3 days of committee in 1 week and 2 consecutive days on report is not what they are taught when they go to the Managing a Bill lecture. Thank you. On our side, the team has been stellar. Lord Tunnicliffe, near silent but businesslike. My noble friends McNichol, Goldsmith, Murphy, Bassam, as well as Ladies Smith, Thornton and Jones, with as ever Dan Smith and Ben Kaufman behind the scenes. I think it is a magnificent troop. But our regrets are also sincere, that despite the arguments set out across the House, not simply on these benches, the government has turned a deaf ear to improvements, either in the processes in the bill, or to safeguard the independence of the courts, or to hear pleas for reassurances from EU citizens, for requests from the devolved authorities, and we've heard the results of not listening there, or indeed to the needs of refugee children. And now we hear the government will use its majority to overturn all 4 of our reasonable and reasoned amendments. We do not lay that on the ministers in this House, but on their masters, or perhaps even a servant, elsewhere. For the moment, as Ed Murrow would say, good night and good luck.
I too would like to thank everyone involved on the bill, ministers, opposition, crossbenchers, the bill team and other officials, as well as the clerks and other staff of the House. And as the Noble Lord Callanan mentioned, the committees of this House, which provided us with such useful and timely reports. Plus, of course, I want to thank the many colleagues on my own Liberal Democrat benches, too numerous, in fact, to mention, who've taken part on the bill, and as well as my leader, Dick Newby, and Chief Whip, Ben Stoneham, and our adviser, Elizabeth Plummer, who is, quite frankly, indispensable to us. Clearly, we would have preferred not to have had this bill. We, on these benches, continue to think that Brexit is a bad mistake and that the UK will, sooner or later, rejoin the EU. We feel that this bill has been improved by the detailed scrutiny and votes in this House that I entirely believe we were right to deliver. We have improved the bill in 2 major respects. One, in respect for people, the rights of EU citizens and child refugees, and secondly, respect for the law and the Constitution regarding the courts and judicial independence and the devolution settlement. We hope that the other place will consider those carefully, but I bear in mind what the noble lady, Lady Hayter, has just said. I strongly believe that we have given value for the many days of work we have done on this bill, and I just wish that the government was in listening mode.
Yeah. I'll not delay the House for very long. I know we all want to get home. But I had a conversation with a distinguished noble friend of mine just a few hours ago, and he said, of course, the government will give a few small amendments on it. They'll give way on certain amendments on this and to satisfy your lordship's House. I strongly disagreed with him on that, and indeed the noble Lady Hayter has confirmed that the government will use its majority to turn down all these amendments. And there could only be two reasons as to why the government would not want to do that. One is because there's a tremendous fault in the legislation and there's certain drafting that's completely inconsistent and needs to be adjusted. There seems to be none of that. There'll be no compelling arguments as to why this bill should be adjusted in any way. And the other is to create goodwill in your Lordship's house. I have to say, there is no goodwill towards your Lordship's house in the other place. We have lost all our friends who ensured that we continued as an appointed house. Jessie Norman, who is key to all that, is a minister in the government, and we roughed up everybody else. The Noble Lord Howarth earlier on described the government as suffering from euphoria as a result of its majority. I think euphoria is a bit strong. I think the government now has a great feeling of relief that it now has a majority which will enable it to ensure that the people's wish in a referendum in 2016 is actually fulfilled. But the government, I think, and the people that I talk to in the other place, feel there has been a conspiracy, both in this House and in the House of Commons, of Remainers to ensure that we stayed in the EU. I have to say that the debate I've been listening to here on this bill gives me the impression that the House is now resigned to the fact that we're going to leave the EU, but they're going to make those negotiations as difficult as possible for the government so that they'll get a very bad deal and they can be justified in their view that we should never have left. The storm clouds are gathering, my lords. There's a constant speculation in the press as to what's going to happen to this House, and we seem to be completely oblivious to it. So I think we should be very careful as to where we go over the coming months.
Lords, that is the most ill-judged...
Order. You cannot speak from that bench. You cannot speak from that bench.
I'll move over. I apologise for speaking from the Bishop's bench, and I hope I'll be forgiven. But I just want to put on record that the speech we've just heard is the most ill-judged speech I have heard for many long years. This House has behaved entirely properly. I believe it's a great pity that there were votes against this bill, and I made that plain when I spoke on second reading. The will of the people, of course, must prevail. But to pretend that this House has behaved improperly is wrong. We have a place in our Constitution which we must honour. And my noble friend, I think, is entirely inaccurate in suggesting that what has happened in this place over the last 2 days has done great damage. I wish it had not proceeded as it had, but I believe behaviour has been right. The only thing that could jeopardise this place would be returning any amendments to the other place, and that I trust we will not do.
Okay. The question is that this bill do now pass. As many of that opinion say content? Yes. The contrary not content? The contents have it.
Okay. I beg to move that this House do now adjourn.
The House do now adjourn.